Hello Amiga lovers and welcome back to another Wrangler video. This time we're going to take a deep dive into this thing, the PowerPC processor, and adding it to your Amiga. And I have talked about this subject before, but I thought I would go through it again in a bit more detail because it isn't that easy to set up a PowerPC card on your Amiga, and it does require a bit of fiddling about and causes people a lot of difficulty. So on this video I'm going to walk through it in more detail. By the way, I should say, if you like the videos that you're seeing on my YouTube channel here, hit the subscribe button down below and that way you'll know when the next video comes out. Okay, so we're going to look at PowerPC in more detail. First of all, we're going to talk about the hardware side of things. Then we'll look at software. It's important to get both things right to get the whole thing to work, and the pinnacle of the software is Warp 3D, which in itself tends to cause a lot of problems, so we'll talk about that too. But first, let's talk about hardware. And there's something really important to say straight away, and that is, unless you are using a Blizzard PPC card, do not expect any PowerPC chip to work on the A1200, right? The latest libraries by Headion that are available on the website, and I'll give the link here, they do not work on the A1200. They might partly work, you might get some things to go some way, but eventually they'll fail. Headion doesn't support it. He's tried for ages to get it to work on the A1200. It does not work. Don't waste your time, it's not worth it, it doesn't work. Same thing goes for the ACA 500 Plus. You might be thinking, great idea, I can add one of those to my A500 or A500 Plus. That gives me the kind of slot that an A1200 has. I can add my mediator to that, etc. Again, it doesn't work, don't try. Actually, just trying to add the mediator to the ACA 500 Plus, I've tried it, it doesn't work, you can't do anything, and actually there's a risk of damaging your hardware. So don't bother, it doesn't work. So what does work? Let's talk about that then. What we're really talking about here is big box Amigas. So the A3000, like this one here, this happens to be the AA3000 Plus, but don't let that concern you. A3000s are fine, A4000s fine, and their tower variants are fine. So not the A1200, not the A500, not the A2000 either. You need Zorro 3 slots for this. Although we are looking at the AA3000 Plus here, which has a Prometheus daughter board here along the edge, actually Headion hasn't released his library yet for supporting PowerPC on the Prometheus. We're just looking at this Amiga because it's just easy. I've got it open anyway to work on it inside, so it's easier to show you around the kinds of things to think about on a hardware side on this machine. But if you are going to set this up for yourself, then you need one of those big box Amigas I mentioned and a mediator card from Lbox. Headion's library has been working for a long time on mediator Amigas, so that's what you need, and that will get you up and going. So you've got your mediator, you've got your big box Amiga. What next? What are the hardware considerations? Well, there are three things to think about. They are power, heat and noise. So let's just walk through those one by one. Number one, power. So in order to get the PowerPC card working at all, you need a decent power supply in your machine, and that might sound obvious, and it might sound easy, but actually it could cause all sorts of problems. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, think about the power supply unit. So in this machine I'm using a modern ATX Flex type power supply. Perhaps let's talk about modern power supplies in a minute. Suppose this were the original power supply. Well, that was probably made, what, 30 years ago, maybe more than that by now. Has it been recently recapped? Is it working at maximum efficiency? Those are questions to ask. I would have thought by now probably be best to get your power supply recapped if you can, in order, if you're going to use a PowerPC card in your computer, because the power drain is going to be that much higher. So just as an example, I measured it on this machine at the wall. This entire Amiga draws about 65 watts, everything turned on. If I'm running the PowerPC card in here in something demanding, then that can take up to about 12 watts of extra power at the wall to run the entire machine. Might typically be half that, but it can be as much as 12 watts. So your power supply unit needs to be capable of supplying that extra power to your system. At 65 watts, that's about half the running rating of this power supply, so it's not pushing it to the limit. Again, that's another thing to be thinking about, are your overall power supply demands, once you've got everything working, pushing your power supply to the limit or not. The other thing to think about on power is power distribution. So it's all very well the power supply being up to spec and capable of delivering the right amount of power, but can it actually get it to the PowerPC card on your PCI slots? So one part of that is power transmission. So normally the power into the Amiga would go down into the motherboard single point connector. On the A3000 it's here, but on this daughter board Hesse has very thoughtfully added a Molex connector, so I'm injecting power straight into the daughter board. Now some of the mediators have this kind of design too, and have a Molex delivering 5 volts on the red line and 12 volts on the yellow line here straight into the daughter board, and that certainly ensures that we're getting good quality power straight into the Zorro slots and the PCI slots. If you don't have this direct connection, I think you've really got to check that you're getting decent power to the daughter board. And although it sounds sort of challenging to do it, it is probably worth testing when the machine's switched on that you're getting power in the right places here, and close to 5 volts. You need, 4.9 volts as a sort of minimum is the kind of figure you need to be getting at the slots here for things to be working okay. Another thing to think about is not just 5 volts but 3.3 volts. So some of the adding cards, PowerPC cards, need 3.3 volts to operate. So let me show you an example of those. So here is the Sonnet 7200 card, and I managed to find where I put it. So there you go, Sonnet Crescendo 7200. So this was the original PowerPC card that Hedion wrote the drivers for. This requires 3.3 volts to be supplied through the PCI slot. Now the Prometheus daughter board here won't create 3.3 volts for itself. Some of the mediator cards will, but at a relatively low level of current. So the question is, well, where is that 3.3 volt power supply going to come from? Well, one possibility, I suppose, is I'm using an ATX PSU at the back here. It has an orange power line which is 3.3 volts, so I could connect that straight into the PCI slots here. I haven't done that. Not sure I've quite got the guts to do that on my daughter board, but it is certainly a possibility. The other one is actually to mod your PowerPC card, and you could certainly do that on the Sonnet, and that involves putting in place this power chip here, power regulator chip, that takes the 5 volt input that it will get through the PCI connector and producing its own 3.3 volt supply. So I've done that mod here. The details of this, and indeed how to set up the software side of PowerPC that we'll talk about in a minute, all of those details are available on the PowerPC library wiki tab page. And let me give you a link to that, either up there or down below. I will do a link to show you where to find those pages, but that shows you how to do the mod there. If you can wield a soldering iron with just a little bit of dexterity, you can add one of those onto your Sonic card, get that working. But what about other sorts of card? Well, what we do have is cards like this one that we looked at before. So this is the PowerPC card here, but it's actually sitting on a carrier board, which is this here, the Ramix 239. I looked at this in a previous video. One attractive feature of these cards is this power section up here, and what this little circuit is doing is creating a local 3.3 volt power supply just for the PowerPC card from 5 volt input on the PCI connector. So when I'm using my Ramix, I don't need to worry about a 3.3 volt connection on the daughter board, because the Ramix is doing it for me. This is like the sort of inbuilt mod equivalent to the power regulator that I've got here that I've added to my Sonnet. So, you know, either with the Ramix or with my modified Sonic card, I can just add them into a 5 volt daughter board. Something to check out if you are thinking of doing PowerPC stuff on your Amiga is just this point about power. 3.3 volts, where is it going to come from? Those are a couple of the options. So that was part one, was power. Now on to part two, which is heat. I think I said that the PowerPC uses up to about 12 watts of power. That starts having an effect, and all that heat has to go somewhere. So what to do with it? Well, let's just look at those two cards again that I have. Let's start off with the Sonic card. You can see the rather colourful heatsink here. I mean, that is absolutely massive heatsink on a relatively small chip, and that is its way of dissipating all the heat that the PowerPC generates, is through passive cooling. And I've got to say, when you start running this thing, that heatsink gets really pretty hot. So question, where's all that heat going to go? That's one part of it. The other part of it is, what about something like the Apocalypse card? So let me show you one of those. So there's the Apocalypse card, and you can see here we've got a metal heatsink just sort of covering the PowerPC chip. You just about see that sort of green edge there is the edge of the PowerPC chip with a metal heatsink on it. So that's its way of cooling. A much smaller heatsink, by the way, so kind of how are we going to keep that cool? Well, it then comes to the question of fans. So the Ramix has its own fan there. So what the Ramix is doing is drawing in drawing in air through the back of the card there, over the black heatsink in this case, and then out through the top of the card. So it's pulling in sort of fresh, cooler air from the rest of the room outside the case and blowing the excess into the case. So the airflow is in and up. And when that's in the computer, like that, that is just depositing all the hot air into the case. Bear in mind that for any of these PowerPC setups, we also need to have a video card, retargetable graphics card in the computer, so which is typically a Voodoo 3 card, they get very hot in their own right. So that's chucking off heat as well. We've got the PowerPC depositing heat inside the case. What's going to happen to all of that? Well, it's going to stay in the case if we've got the lid on, and it's being blown in at this end. The fan on my power supply actually sucks air in through these vents, so from inside the case, and blows it out the back of the computer. So generally there'll be an airflow in towards the front of the case in this direction, across the front of the computer, and then out the back. That's the general airflow, sort of U-shape around the computer. But you know, that's an A3000, and I guess for anybody who's spent any time with an A3000, they are pretty cramped cases, and airflow is a bit of an issue with them. Cooling just generally a bit of an issue with the A3000. So it is a question about whether to add any extra fans. Sort of similar thoughts, I think, probably true for the A4000 as well, the desktop version. Again, perhaps a little bit more space than this case, but not a huge amount. So question of airflow there too. I think when you get to the tower computers, there's there's more space in those. It's slightly less cramped, but even so, by modern standards, airflow in Amiga cases, the standard Amiga cases, is pretty poor. So something to think about is, where is all that heat going from the various cards once you get them up and running? And as I say, certainly extra fans can be helpful. So in my setup here, how might that work? Well, maybe a fan here on the edge of the PCI slots that blow or sucks air in this direction towards the front, so that would support the air coming around in a U-shape. That might be one idea. Something else I've done on another machine is to add a fan at the back beyond the PCI slots here on the outside of the case, that's blowing air in. So that supports, again, this U-shaped airflow around the case. But there is a bit of a question about fans, which we'll come on to in a minute, but fans might well be one way to go in order to provide and ensure that cooling isn't an issue. And I suppose, how to work out when overheating might be a problem, well, it's not always easy to tell. I think that's the first thing. But if you are finding that your PowerPC is working to begin with, you start up the machine, you start the PowerPC, everything seems to be going fine, but after 5 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, suddenly the machine starts crashing, and that's pretty consistent. It could well be heat that is causing the problem, and that might be the place to look. If you're getting crashes sort of straight away, as soon as you start the PowerPC up, it's probably not heat, it's probably something else like power, or maybe the software setup that we'll talk about later. So that's part 2, is heat. On to number 3, which is noise. And noise is something I hadn't thought about at all on PowerPCs until quite recently, because I was having real trouble getting this card stable in this machine, and I just could not work out what was going on. I had a modern power supply, which seems to be well rated, have sufficient power to it. The quality of power getting onto the daughter board was okay. Heat didn't seem to be an issue, could have been, but it wasn't conclusive. I could not work out what the issue was until I thought about this, my hard disk. So you might have seen in earlier videos I was using a hard disk in this machine, and eventually I worked out that it was this hard disk creating noise. Remember, it normally goes here. The hard disk creating noise right next to where the PowerPC card is, that was causing errors in the PowerPC. Now, when I say noise, what kind of noise do I mean? Not audible noise, but electrical or magnetic noise. I'm not exactly sure which one it is, but when this hard disk was in the system, I got crashes. I've taken it out now and replaced it with, under here, a SCSI to SD card. Beautiful things these are, lower power, and it doesn't have the same electromagnetic noise as one of these. Suddenly my stability is much better on this computer. Just out of interest, what kind of hard disk is this? Well, this is from a server farm. It's one of these SCA 80 SCSI hard drives. So these are fairly readily available. They work very well in Amiga, by the way, normally. And they're readily available and cheap, certainly a lot cheaper than the SCSI to SD card, but they do not play well with PowerPC cards, and I think it's due to electromagnetic noise. If you're running one of these in a tower case, you might have sufficient distance between the PowerPC card and the hard drive that it doesn't matter, but in a desktop case like this, have a real thing. If you've got stability issues that just don't seem to make any sense, have a think about whether it's a mechanical hard drive in the system that's causing it. And just while we're on that subject, it hasn't happened to me, but other users have said that fans added into their systems for cooling purposes actually have also created electromagnetic noise that's made the PowerPC unstable. So you're kind of left in a bit of a dilemma there, aren't you? Which is, I've got problems with heat because there's heat build up after a time, so I'm going to add a fan, but the fan adds noise, which might introduce a different kind of instability. So where do I go? It's a real conundrum, and I'd love to say that I've got a simple answer for you, but I don't. I'm afraid it's one of those things where you just have to troubleshoot it to try and work out what is the problem. Is it heat or is it electromagnetic noise? I think the final thing to say about hardware stuff, well, a couple of final things actually, is there have been some posts on the main thread talking about PowerPC, which is on EAB, by the way. If you need to sort of look back at what people have commented, it's all on there. But some people have talked about the fact that the card order in the slots here, whether you have the Ramix first and then the Voodoo card, or the Voodoo and then the Ramix, or whatever other PCI cards, the order of them matters. I must say I've never really experienced that myself, but it might be a factor, particularly if the PowerPC chip crashes straight away. That might be something just to try out, swap the card order around, see if that fixes things. It's either going to work or it doesn't work based on card order. The other thing I've seen said, again, I've not experienced this myself, is that the top PCI slot, particularly in mediators, doesn't have PCI termination in it, so you need a card in the top slot to provide properly terminated PCI connections. Like I say, that doesn't ever seem to have been a problem for me, but might be something to try, even if it means leaving gaps in the other PCI slots. Put a card in the top slot, see if that fixes things. And sort of finally on hardware stuff, before we start talking about software, if you're going to be using Hedion's library, what kind of 68K processor do you need? Well, the answer to that, at least currently, is that you need a 68040 or a 68060, and in either case with a memory management unit in it. Because it does rely on the MMU. I've not seen any reports that any particular 040 or 060 card causes problems, so pretty much any accelerator with one of those two chips in it will work. What doesn't work is any 030 card, even if you've got an MMU in it, I'm afraid, sorry, it doesn't work, so you have to have an 040 or an 060. Maybe an 040 might be okay, barring heat issues, because the load on the 68K is not going to be that great if you're primarily just using the PowerPC. So maybe you don't need to spend huge amounts of money on a 68060. An 040 might be good enough for your needs. And the other question that comes up from time to time is, can I use a Cyberstorm PowerPC accelerator for 68K in the computer along with a PowerPC on my PCI daughter board here? And the answer to that is yes, you can, but there is a proviso. So I could be using under here a Cyberstorm PowerPC accelerator with no 40 or no 60 with memory management unit. I could be using that, but the libraries only support the PowerPC chip on the PCI slot. The PowerPC slot on the PowerPC chip on the Cyberstorm PPC won't work. It'll just be sitting there idle the whole time. But you can have that set up running, and people have had that running successfully. So I think that's it on hardware stuff. Those three issues, and they're really worth having a think about before you get too far: power, heat, noise. So that's hardware. Let's now have a look at software. So on to software, and the place really to give you, first of all, as a reference point on all of this is the wiki tab on the main library web page. Again, I'll provide a link to that either in the comments down below or up in the corner somewhere. But if you click on the wiki tab, then on that wiki page is a first time installation guide, and I thoroughly recommend reading that and working through it step by step. It was written when the only accelerator at the time was the Sonnet 7200, but more or less those instructions work for all the other PowerPC cards. The library has evolved a little bit, so some of the steps may not strictly be required for every single PowerPC processor type, but to be honest, doing them anyway won't cause any harm. And it also means that if you swap your PowerPC card for a different one, you will automatically not have to face any compatibility problems because you missed out steps along the way. So I thoroughly recommend reading that and working through it, and in essence I'm going to walk you through the key points from that wiki page as we go through right now. But there are 4 steps to the software installation. Number 1 is getting the basic operating system up and running. Number 2 is getting the mediator working, installing the PowerPC, and lastly getting Warp 3D working. And it's really pretty important to get those 4 things in that order and not halfway round the other way. So let's start with the basic operating system, part 1. And the thing there is, as irritating as it might sound, it is much better to start with a completely fresh installation of Amiga OS, because otherwise any other software that you've got involved in the system, and particularly OS patches, might be the things that are causing the problems. So start with a fresh install. And however, having said that, most of the main kind of operating systems that people are likely to be using, so OS 3.9 with Boeing Bag 2 or 4, or OS 3.1.4, they all seem to work absolutely fine. I haven't seen any reported issues that are part of the operating system. So get your OS installed from start. So part number 2 is to get the mediator software working. So you'll need the mediator CD that came with your mediator card to do that. But also don't forget to download PCI.library from LBox. Use the latest version from their website because the library is updated to correspond with the latest PCI library. Also, when you are setting up the mediator software, don't forget to set the environment variables for the mediator. Now they will be to set your buster type and also some memory settings and other settings for your Voodoo cards. So they are Voodoo Mem, Voodoo Mem OS and Voodoo Int. Set them all up and that will get the mediator in the right sort of configuration for PowerPC later on. So once you've got mediator set up, then it's a question of getting Picasso 96 installed, and of course that's now available for purchase from individual computers, so that's where to get that from. And it's, you know, just really important that you could get Picasso 96 up and running on your Voodoo card like it is here, and that retargetable graphics is working fine and stably before you go any further. So let's say we've done those two steps, now on to the PowerPC specific part of it. So before you put the PowerPC card into your mediator, then just make sure you've got the configuration jumpers on the mediator set correctly. So there are 3 of those. Again, this is all on the wiki page, but you need to close the win size and master jumpers, and then the config one can either be open or closed. It depends what other cards you've got in the system. One way will work probably and one way won't work, so just set that as you need to for the rest of your system to function properly. And once you've done all that and you put the PCI card into your system, then what you should be able to do is open a shell, window, and type PCI info, which will tell you about all the different all the different PCI cards you've got in your machine, which are here. But what I want you to focus on is this one right at the bottom here. For me, it's saying PCI device 6 is by Motorola, and that's the indication that this is the PowerPC card that it has found in the PCI slot. So yours might not be device number 6, it might be elsewhere in the order, but you will find, or you ought to find, your card somewhere in the PCI list. If you don't find it there, something has gone wrong already. It may be that your PowerPC card isn't in the slot properly, or it's broken perhaps, or maybe there's just not enough power getting to it, I suppose. But really, unless you can get this far, something pretty fundamental isn't right. Okay, let's assume that you've found your PowerPC card in the PCI device list. Then you need to start installing the library files for PowerPC. And there are 3 of those. Well, strictly one is the PowerPC library itself, which goes in libs : and then there are a couple of commands, init ppc and get info, that go into your C directory. Now, just call out here that PowerPC library that you will find on the website is not the same as the one produced by Hager and Partner for the Cyberstorm and Blizzard PowerPC cards. This is the re-engineered version by Hedeon that implements the same functions but using code that he's written from scratch. So don't get them confused, and whatever you do, don't install the Hager and Partner PowerPC library, because it won't work on the PowerPC cards that you're adding into PCI slots. Then what you do is to test that the PowerPC card is working, and there are particular instructions for rebooting your machine with no startup sequence, and then setting up a very sort of minor operating system to check that the card is working. That is the better way to do it, but because I already know my machine's working here, I'm in Workbench already and just going to show you how to get things going. what you need to do is to run init PPC, which I can do by this icon up here, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But that's going to run init PPC, which remember we put in the C directory just now, and then we can run get info, and maybe let me zoom in a bit on that lot so you can see what it's saying, and maybe if I move it into a location where you can see everything. There we go. So it's found my PowerPC CPU there, the 7410. It's telling me that the clock on the CPU on the PowerPC is 450 megahertz, and it's running on a bus of 100 megahertz. Your figures might be different. If you're using a Ragnarok card, for example, this will be something like 800 megahertz. If you're using a Sonnet 7200, it could be a different figure, but your bus clock is probably 66, 67 megahertz, something like that. So these figures will be for your card. The rest of this stuff I don't think you need to concern yourself with too much, but it's just sort of diagnostic info. I think the other thing that we can do is just to do PCI info again, and here's our device 6 by Motorola, so my PowerPC card, but at the bottom here various memory space details are given because we've run our PowerPC command init PPC to start the thing going. It has identified and allocated all the memory address ranges for the PowerPC card. So if you can get similar kind of results for yourself when you've gone through this process, you know, restart without startup sequence, get info, PCI info, get similar sorts of results to that, it shows that the library has set up the PowerPC card correctly. And so that stage, the basic operation of the PowerPC card is fine. What can go wrong? Well, if the init PPC is unhappy with the setup in some way, it will open up a requester with some kind of error message which will give an indication of what's going wrong. So you will know if something's not working. Perhaps another thing to add is that init PPC does take a second or two to run, so don't be too alarmed if you know, you hit return and nothing seems to happen for a few seconds. That's normal. It's going away and doing quite a lot of work in the background. A little bit more on getting this going on a more sort of regular basis. You need to run init PPC after load mondrivs in your startup sequence, and that is because some PowerPC cards need to use some of the memory space on your graphics card, on your Voodoo, to actually get going. Not all of them need that, but some of them do. So the general advice is run init PPC in your startup sequence after the load mondrivs command, in other words loading the monitor drivers. Actually I prefer, and you've seen this before, is to have it all in an icon, in my start PPC icon here, which is just a little batch file that just copies the library into libs and then runs init PPC, and that way I can either start the PowerPC or not when I'm in Workbench, do that manually. I prefer it that way. If you're going to do this kind of thing in the way I just described it, you need to delete the PowerPC library out of libs early on in your startup sequence, otherwise it'll automatically load the library, and if there's a problem with your system that could cause crashes every time you try and get into Workbench. So I hope that made sense. It's the way I've got it set up. Maybe let's have a quick look at that. Is in startup sequence. Let me just find that. You can see I've got a line here, delete libs PowerPC library to nil, so it's quiet when it does that. So it just, if it finds PowerPC.library and libs, it will just delete it early on in the startup sequence, so any problems with the library won't interfere with Workbench loading, and then I can use the icon to start the PowerPC. Right, so once you've got that far, of course, the game is, well, what other things can you do now that you've got a working machine? So one thing, I guess, is BOGO MIPS. Let's see if we've got that installed. No, we haven't. Let's see if I can find that quickly. Well, I can't actually reach the keyboard very well. So I tend to keep all my stuff in Tools, Sonnet, Tools, I think it is, BOGO MIPS. So that is a standard sort of benchmarking tool for PowerPC and other processors. I think it runs on Linux and all sorts of operating systems. Just check out the basic integer instruction processing capabilities of the CPU. So it's calculated 909, well, let's call it 910 BOGO MIPS on my card here, which is an Apocalypse card. So that might give you a sort of a sense of what to expect from a benchmark test like that. I mean, you know, benchmarks, well, what do they mean when you get to the real world? I know, but it perhaps just shows you whether your card's working sort of basically properly or not. Perhaps a little call out for the other things that you will find in the library archive. So there's BOGO MIPS as well as GetInfo and Init PPC. If you've got a Ragnarok card, you're lucky enough to have one of those, you will find an overclocking tool or a clock changing tool, so you can underclock as well as overclock. One that I wrote a little while ago, so you could try overclocking your CPU. I wouldn't push that too far, by the way, because overheating will be a real issue, but you can experiment with bumping up the clock speed from 800 to 900 megahertz, or maybe even a gigahertz. I've got a machine that will handle a gigahertz, so see if you can do that. Overclocking, by the way, doesn't work on any of the other PowerPC cards. They have fixed clock rates. Alright, so the thing basically works. It's run a benchmarking tool. Another thing to try before we do anything more complex is CyberPi. I think I might have shown you this in previous videos. So this is from the archive, if memory serves, for the Hager and Partner Warpup software, so you can find it on there. CyberPi and CyberMand as well, but CyberPi first. You type in CyberPi and then the number of iterations you want, so 5000, which you can see for this CPU is no task whatsoever. If I hadn't started the PPC, by the way, it would automatically switch to the 68K if my memory is correct, so that might be one way to benchmark PowerPC versus 68K. You will notice quite a difference. So you can, you know, fiddle around with that to your heart's content. There's 10,000 decimals. I'm not checking all of those. CyberMand, again from the same archive. Let's just try that. It's going to ask me to pick a screen size, 640 by 480. Let's see. Let's get that in center. So that does the old Mandelbrot stuff in black and white or grey or something. So you can go in and out with that. I mean, you know, nothing particularly sort of groundbreaking on that, but it just proves that your card is doing what it should be doing. Right. I think one other thing I should say before we go any further is in all of this, it is actually really helpful to get your basic workbench screen mode correct, and for best compatibility I would recommend using 16-bit PC mode, because that will be more compatible with all the games that you're likely to want to play, because we're all gamers at heart, aren't we? So set up your workbench in 16-bit mode. What else can we try? Another little test that the machine's working properly, which is a little bit more graphical, is scroll up a bit, is voxel space. I will can't exactly remember where this comes from, which sort of archive this is from. If I work it out, I'll put a note up in where am I? Up in the corner of the screen for where this comes from. But if you run voxel space for CyberGraphics, and then it's going to ask me what screen mode I want. So 640 by 480 is the best screen mode for this. And let's just zoom out a bit. And we're presented with our 3D landscape, which we can fly over. And in the top left hand corner there, it's just giving some stats on the refresh rate. So, you know, you can have fun competing with everybody else on getting the fastest refresh rate. But again, that is beginning to just help us understand that the card is set up correctly, it's running okay, and this actually, voxel space can be a good test, because this is not running Warp 3D to do this. It's just a good test that the basic setup that you've got is running stably. Just leave this for half an hour, just check that it can still run after that length of time, just to prove stability of that you haven't got heat issues, for example, or any of that electromagnetic interference I was talking about before. Before we talk about Warp 3D as a final part here, I think there's something else we should cover, and that is Mmu configurations, because this seems to cause a lot of misunderstandings. So let's cover that. I'm just going to do my PCI info command again, because we're going to need some of that in a minute. And the other thing I'm going to do is call our edit pad and show you my configuration. So I think I said earlier in this video that you need a memory management unit on your 68K processor in order to use the library. And if you're going to use an MMU, then actually Thor's MMU lib is probably the thing to install to ensure that the MMU is used properly. And MMU library needs a file called Mmu Configuration, which I think you might have seen just then I loaded up from my envarc directory. So when you install mmu.library, this ought to get generated by default, but it may not have the right settings for you in there. So when you install the PowerPC, I think it's a really good idea to have a look through your Mmu configuration file, and you might need to update it to get the best out of your system, and again to narrow down on any instabilities that you find. Getting this right is really important. So let me walk you through it. The first line that's not commented out is this clear TTX line, which I think is just a standard part of Mmu configuration, so don't change that. Then I have got this line in here. You probably don't need this, but if you are running an Apollo 4060, 3060, one of those kind of cards, you need this line. And the problems I had working that out on this computer until I read all the documentation for Mmu library. It is in there, but I hadn't read it. You need this line in your configuration file to get Thor's library working properly on an Apollo card. Other kinds of accelerators don't seem to need this. The really important bit that I want to draw your attention to is this section here, which is setting all the cache modes, and it is worth spending a little bit of time and care on this to get this right. So let me walk you through my settings. Let me just move that down there for a minute and do a show config, because that's going to give us some helpful info at the same time. So what we've got to do is ensure that the MMU is going to reserve certain memory spaces so that they're not cached by the system. And in particular, the two spaces that it's worth setting like this are chip mem and also the PowerPC's own memory space. So I've just done a show config to illustrate this, and we've got 3 different memory spaces on this machine here. Yours might be different. Again, let me just zoom in a bit just so it can be absolutely clear what we're talking about here. So I've got fast mem, 2 lots of fast mem and a chip mem. How can I tell them apart? Well, chip mem is clearly, that's on the motherboard, but what about the 2 fast mems? This one with attributes 2005 is the PowerPC's own fast memory. Obviously this is only going to show up after you run init PPC, and that must mean that this fast memory with the 5 attribute is the motherboard fast mem. So my 3 sets of memory are motherboard fast, PowerPC fast, and then chip mem. Okay, so that's identified what they are, and then the memory spaces are these figures over here. So let's just scoot down to my Mmu config file, which I will just move up the screen so you can see it. Get this all on the screen at once. Let's start with the first line. So set cache mode from location 0, so the start of memory, for 200000, so 5 zeros. So that is the chip mem space. That is corresponding with this memory location here. Remember, all of these addresses, the OX signifies this is a hexadecimal number, the $ also hexadecimal. These are memory spaces, and this is the same location as this. This is saying start at location 0 for that amount of memory, which corresponds to 2 megabytes, which is that amount of memory there, and then set the flags associated with it as cache inhibit, non-serial, imprecise, so don't cache that memory. Then I've got second line here is starting at 8 and 6 zeros for 8 and 6 zeros, so that corresponds with my first entry up here. So that's my fast mem space that is on my motherboard, or in fact on my processor card here, 128 megabytes. I'm setting that to copy back mode, so that can be cached. Only the 68060 is going to use that space, so I can set that freely to be copy back. That's fine. And then the third line, which is really important for us, is the PowerPC memory, which is starting at 5 and then 7 zeros, which is that location there, at least approximately, for another 128 megabytes, is again the same as chip mem on the top. So your settings will be different, particularly for things like where your PPC memory is and how much of it you've got. So read it off show config. You can also read it off PCI info, so you've got similar kind of information here. So if you look in mem space 2, that's 5 and then 7 zeros up until 5, 8 and 6 zeros, so that corresponds to this entry, third entry in my Mmu config. So hopefully that makes sense, but just really quite important to get that right, so that you don't have any sort of memory corruption problems, which again can be really pretty difficult to narrow down. I should also say that at the end of the wiki first time installation guide, there's some other things just to set up that improve stability on your machine. One is some AHI settings that for the music and unit 0, set those to Paula 8-bit DMA. It'll work much better that way if it works at all. Sorry, let me say that the other way around. If you don't set it to 8-bit DMA on Paula, you may not get any sound at all, and it might crash the game or whatever application you're trying to use. The other thing is Stack Attack 2, which is on Aminet. That also is worth installing because the standard stack sizes that Amiga OS uses are pretty tiny, and once you start opening up all of these PowerPC libraries, it's easy to exceed those. So you need to get that installed as part of your startup sequence as well, but details of that in the wiki. Alright, so we're on to part 4. I've sort of lost count of where we are on the different parts now, but we're definitely on to part 4 with Warp 3D. So how do you get that going? Just to recap, we've got everything so far is set up and working absolutely fine, let's say, and that proves that the basic hardware and software is working fine. So let's tackle Warp 3D. We've got our workbench screen in 16-bit PC mode. We then need to set some environment variables, and let me just show you those, because it just seems slightly counterintuitive. See if I can find where that is. So under envarc, you can't see it. You still can't see it. Let's move that down there. Envarc mediator. There is a file called Warp 3D, or an envarc called Warp 3D, and you need to set that to no if you're going to use Hedion's PowerPC library. Seems really odd, doesn't it? If you're installing Warp 3D, why do you set it to no? I know it seems the opposite of what you want to do, but it's what you got to do. So there it is. The other thing you need to do is then to install the Warp 3D for Mediator archive from Lbox's website, and copy the libraries across. Again, it's better to just look on the wiki for the details of those, because it's all listed on there, to copy the right libraries into the right places for Picasso 96 to pick them up in the right places, and also copy across the Warp 3D demos. So once you've done all that, then the task is to just check that it's all working. So I was going great guns there right up until the point where the battery ran out on my camera. So let me pick up where I left off with checking that Warp 3D works. So we're back at Workbench here, and let me find where I have put the Warp 3D demo files, which are here. It's really tempting, as soon as you've got all the various libraries and everything installed, just to hit one of these icons on the left, which are the PowerPC Warp 3D demo programs, but I would just caution against doing that. What I would suggest doing first is pick one of these on the right, which is running Warp 3D on the 68K side first. So let me just hit that, and the reason for doing that is simply to check that the 68K Warp 3D is fine, because if this doesn't work, then it's unlikely that the PowerPC Warp 3D is going to work either. So start with 68K. As you can see on this system, it is working. That is looking like it is chugging quite a bit. I guess that was all the 68K can manage in this computer at any rate. Maybe it was impressive at the time that it came out, but that is looking a little bit laboured there. So let's put it out of its misery and quit the 68K side. So that's working, and now try the equivalent thing on the PowerPC. Let's do that in a window this time, and that is looking much more happy, really looking very comfortable. If you hit F in Gear's PPC version, this doesn't work in the 68K version, but if you do it in the PPC version, hit F on the keyboard, and then it gives you a frame rate counter up here in the top left hand corner. So if I stop wiggling the mouse about, we can see that that gets about, what, 85 frames a second on this card. So that perhaps gives you some sort of yardstick to compare your system against, just to see that it's working as it should do. As you can see, Warp 3D working very happily there. So that's kind of proof that all the libraries work, that Warp 3D is in fact working absolutely fine on this system, and then the sky's the limit. So what else could you run that works under Warp 3D? Well, there are lots of games out there that rely on Warp 3D. Just to throw out the names of a few, there's Quake 1, 2 and 3, all conversions by Cowcat, and all really playable on one of these PowerPC cards on a PCI slot. Just one word of caution on that: Quake 3 does require 256 megabytes of RAM to run in, so that means it's probably one for people with Ragnarok cards, Rapture cards, and those few people who've managed to find an Apocalypse card with 256 megabytes on it. Otherwise that won't work, but stick to Quakes 1 and 2. You've also got things like Diablo and Wipeout and other games as well. Cowcat, by the way, continues to do conversions of new games, so he's always updating his sort of list. There are, of course, non-Warp 3D games out there. Just to fly my own flag for a moment, I did conversions of Duke Nukem and of Strategus, which allows you to play Warcraft 2 using the PowerPC. They don't require Warp 3D, so not every game is a Warp 3D game, and they play very nicely on these PowerPC cards. So lots of applications open to you. If you get stuck, by the way, with any of the installation process, and for some reason it's just not working for you, the best place to go is onto the EAB forum. They're under the section Support and Hardware. There's a thread called Sonnet 7200, because that's where it all started. I don't know how many pages we've got to now, but several hundred pages of posts on this subject, and ask the folk on that EAB thread to give you some help. Obviously, the more specific you could be about what your setup is, whether you've followed the first time installation guide, because if you haven't done that, no one's going to help you a great deal, and exactly what your setup is, then you are more likely to get help. Otherwise, let me just wish you good luck setting up your own PowerPC card, and ask you to join me again in the next video. But before you see the end of this video, again, once a reminder to click on the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.